The bridge of PT-109 cuts through absolute darkness like a knife blade. December 7th, 1942. Exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, and Lieutenant Rollin Westholm grips the small wheel of his 80-foot wooden torpedo boat, his knuckles white against the cold metal. The cramped con area reeks of diesel fumes and nervous sweat. His executive officer, Ensign Bryant Larson, stands beside him, both men straining their eyes into the pitch-black waters of Iron Bottom Sound. You have to understand, these weren't seasoned combat veterans. Westholm had arrived in the Solomon Islands just weeks earlier. This was PT-109's first real action, her maiden voyage into hell. The same boat that would later carry John F. Kennedy to fame was tonight carrying two terrified young officers toward the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. The instrument panel above the wheel glows faintly. 3 sets of tachometers, a compass, gauges that seem to mock their situation. 80 feet of plywood and mahogany, 50 tons against 11 Japanese destroyers carrying 240-pound shells. The mathematics of survival don't add up. Anything we could do to get a better track on the Express, Larson would later remember, his voice tight with the memory, was worth trying. But worth dying for? That question hangs in the tropical air like humidity. From the forward machine gun tub, a .50 caliber barrel points into nothing. The darkness is so complete that Westholm can't see the bow of his own boat. Radio chatter crackles through the bridge speakers. 8 PT boats spread across Iron Bottom Sound like moths preparing to challenge an eagle. The water beneath them has earned its name. Dozens of Allied and Japanese ships rest on the bottom, their hulks creating an underwater graveyard that stretches for miles. Tonight, more men are going to die in these cursed waters. The only question is whose blood will join the coral and steel below. Westholm shifts his weight, feeling the boat respond to every subtle movement. 3 Packard Phi 12 engines idle beneath his feet, the only thing standing between his crew and the crushing depth charges of Japanese destroyers. 1,200 horsepower, 41 knots maximum speed, paper-thin wooden hulls that splinter like matchsticks under enemy fire. But here's what the Japanese high command didn't understand, what no amount of naval strategy could have prepared them for. Sometimes the smallest force carries the biggest heart. Sometimes 17-year-old kids from New Jersey and Pennsylvania farm boys turned sailors can change the course of history with nothing but courage and 3 torpedo tubes. The radio hisses. A coast watcher's voice cuts through static. Tokyo Express departed Shortland Harbor. 11 destroyers. Captain Sato commanding. Westholm's jaw tightens. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, 3,000 Japanese sailors are racing toward Guadalcanal with enough supplies to keep their starving garrison fighting for weeks. Between them and their mission stand 8 wooden boats and boys who've never fired a shot in anger. What happened next would prove that terror doesn't always belong to the biggest gun. 6 hours earlier, the plan seemed almost reasonable. Almost. Lieutenant Commander Hugh Robinson had spread charts across the table in the sweltering operations shack on Tulagi Island. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects while sweat dripped onto maps of Iron Bottom Sound. Outside, the tropical heat pressed against the corrugated metal walls like a living thing. The Tokyo Express runs every night, Robinson had explained to his young PT boat skippers, his finger tracing the route down the slot. That narrow channel between parallel rows of Solomon Islands that led directly to Guadalcanal. Destroyers carrying supply drums. They dropped them offshore for their troops to collect. Westholm studied the chart, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. 8 PT boats against the Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced night fighters. The Japanese had been running these supply missions for months, their destroyer captains learning every reef, every current, every hiding spot in these treacherous waters. "Sir," Lieutenant Robert Searles had asked, his voice carefully measured. "What about air support?" Robinson's laugh carried no humor. "One SOC float plane. Maybe." You have to understand the desperation. Guadalcanal was hanging by a thread. Marines were dying on the beaches, starving in the jungle, fighting with ammunition running dangerously low. Every Japanese supply run meant more enemy soldiers fed, more weapons delivered, more American boys coming home in body bags. The Tokyo Express had become a psychological weapon as much as a logistical one. Every night, the rumble of Japanese destroyer engines would echo across Iron Bottom Sound. Every dawn would reveal fresh supply drums scattered along Japanese-held beaches. The message was clear: we own these waters after dark. But Captain Torajiro Sato, commanding the Japanese destroyer force from his flagship, couldn't have imagined what was waiting for him in the darkness ahead. A career naval officer, Sato had spent decades mastering night combat tactics. His destroyers were armed with the deadly Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, weapons that could sink battleships at ranges exceeding 20 miles. His crews were veterans of night battles across the Pacific. What could possibly go wrong against a handful of American torpedo boats? By 11 p.m., the pieces were in motion. Sato's 11 destroyers had already survived one air attack earlier in the day. The destroyer Nowaki limped back to base under tow, her engine room flooded, 17 sailors dead. But 10 destroyers still pressed south, their holds packed with 2,400 supply drums, enough food and ammunition to sustain the Guadalcanal garrison for weeks. Meanwhile, Westholm was positioning his boats for what naval historians would later call one of the most audacious attacks in maritime history. PT-109 and PT-43 would patrol the coastline from Cochabamba to Cape Esperance. PT-48 and PT-40 would watch the northwest approach. 4 more boats, the strike force, would hide behind Savo Island, waiting for the kill. The radio equipment alone should have doomed the mission. These high-frequency sets were designed for aircraft, not the constant pounding of PT boat operations. Atmospheric conditions made communication spotty at best. Japanese forces monitored the same frequencies, turning every radio call into a potential death sentence. The equipment was plagued with problems. Westholm would later write in his after-action report, his words understating a situation that bordered on farcical. Imagine coordinating a complex naval attack using radios that worked about half the time, in waters where a single mistake meant instant death. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect wasn't the equipment failures or the overwhelming odds. It was the men themselves. Boys, really, most barely old enough to vote, suddenly thrust into command of sophisticated warships in one of the most dangerous combat zones on Earth. Ensign Bryant Larson had been out of college for less than 2 years. His job tonight was to help navigate PT-109 through reefs that could gut their wooden hull, while simultaneously coordinating torpedo attacks against enemy ships carrying enough firepower to level a small city. The Japanese approach was textbook perfect. Sato had arranged his destroyers in a precise formation, the supply ships in the center, escorts on the flanks. Radar operators swept the waters ahead, primitive by today's standards, but advanced enough to detect large surface targets. What they couldn't detect were small wooden boats running on muffled engines, their hulls barely registering on early radar screens. At 11:15 p.m., lookouts aboard PT-40 spotted the first shadows on the horizon. Lieutenant Henry Taylor grabbed his radio handset, knowing that his next words would either coordinate a successful attack or serve as his final transmission. The psychological dynamic was about to flip completely. For months, Japanese destroyer captains had owned these waters, their powerful ships moving with impunity through the darkness. They had developed an almost casual confidence in their night superiority. But tonight, They were about to discover what happens when American innovation meets desperate courage. Tonight, the hunters were about to become the hunted. The radio crackled. Contact. Multiple ships, bearing southeast, distance 2 miles. In the cramped bridge of PT-109, Westholm felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Beside him, Larson checked his watch. 11:20 p.m. In the darkness ahead, 3,000 Japanese sailors were about to learn why these Americans had earned the nickname mosquito boats. But mosquitoes, as any Pacific veteran could tell, carry deadly diseases. The first shot splits the night like thunder. PT-48's engines scream as Lieutenant Robert Searles throws his boat into a desperate turn, but it's too late. Japanese searchlights pin his wooden hull against the darkness like a butterfly on display. One engine dies, then another. 50 tons of American torpedo boat suddenly becomes a sitting duck in waters controlled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Christ! Someone shouts over the intercom, but the curse is lost in the roar of incoming shells. You have to understand what this looked like from the Japanese perspective. 11 massive destroyers, each displacing over 2,000 tons, bristling with 5-inch guns and deadly torpedoes, suddenly confronted by gnats, wooden gnats that refused to run. Captain Sato, commanding the destroyer force from his flagship's bridge, watches through night binoculars as his lead ships open fire on the crippled PT boat. The range is point blank, maybe 200 yards. His guns can't miss. But Lieutenant Henry Taylor in PT-40 has other plans. Taylor spins his boat in a suicidal maneuver that defies every principle of naval warfare. Instead of fleeing, he charges directly between the Japanese destroyers and his disabled comrade, laying smoke as his 3 Packard engines scream at maximum power. Tracers light up the night around him, streams of orange death that miss his boat by inches. The audacity is breathtaking. A 50-ton wooden boat deliberately drawing fire from ships that outweigh it 40-1. It works. The Japanese destroyers, trained for a conventional naval warfare, turn to follow this new threat. PT-40 disappears into the darkness, her wake phosphorescent behind her. Searles uses the distraction to limp PT-48 to safety behind Savo Island. But this is just the opening act. 4 miles south, the strike force receives the contact report. Lieutenant John Searles in PT-59 opens his throttles and charges toward the enemy formation. Behind him, 3 more torpedo boats spread into attack formation, their wakes cutting white lines across the black water. The range closes fast. 2 miles, 1 mile, 500 yards. Fire 1! Fire 2! Lester Gamble in PT-37 launches his torpedoes first, the Mark 8 weapons hissing from their tubes like deadly fish. The boat lurches as 3,000 pounds of high-explosive race toward the Japanese formation at 46 knots. But it's PT-59 that writes the night's most incredible chapter. Searles brings his boat so close to the destroyer Kuroshio that he can see individual Japanese sailors manning their guns. The range is less than 100 yards, suicide distance for a wooden boat facing steel warships. Both vessels open fire simultaneously. The destroyer's 5-inch guns boom like rolling thunder. Shells the size of garbage cans whistle overhead, close enough that their passage rocks PT-59's lightweight hull. But the PT boats, .50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon rake the destroyer's superstructure with thousands of rounds per minute. Motor machinist's mate. Second-class Cletus Osborne is manning the forward gun tub when a Japanese shell ignites a belt of ammunition beside his position. Flames leap around him, white-hot magnesium burning at 3,000 degrees. Any rational person would abandon their post. Osborne stays, calmly detaches the flaming ammunition belt, tosses it onto the deck where other crew members extinguish it, then returns to his gun, continuing to pour fire into the Japanese destroyer as if nothing happened. He was completely surrounded by fire, one crew member would later recall, but he never stopped shooting. The exchange lasts maybe 3 minutes, an eternity in naval combat. PT-59 takes at least 10 hits from heavy machine guns, her wooden hull splintering under the impact, but miraculously, no one dies. The boat clears the area under cover of smoke. Her crew transform from boys into combat veterans in the space of a few heartbeats. Meanwhile, Westholm is racing PT-109 toward the sound of gunfire, his boat's 3 engines pushing her at maximum speed through waters that could hide reefs, mines, or enemy submarines. The radio chatter is chaotic. Contact reports, damage assessments, torpedo launch confirmations all mixed together in a symphony of combat communications. When contact was reported, Westholm would later write, they increased speed to about 16 knots and proceeded westward up the Guadalcanal coast. But by the time PT-109 reaches the battle area, something unprecedented has happened. The Japanese destroyer force, 11 powerful warships that should have easily swept aside the American torpedo boats, is withdrawing. Captain Sato, facing an enemy he doesn't understand, makes a command decision that will haunt the Japanese war effort. These aren't conventional torpedo boats following predictable tactics. These are maniacs willing to ram destroyers, sailors who refuse to retreat even when outgunned 40-1. More importantly, the PT boat attacks have disrupted his carefully timed supply schedule. Every minute spent fighting these mosquito boats is a minute his vulnerable destroyers remain in waters dominated by American air power after dawn. The disposition of the boats at the time was considered the best possible to meet all possible approaches of the enemy, Westholm reported, but even he couldn't have predicted the psychological effect on seasoned Japanese naval officers. For the first time in months, a Tokyo Express run has been turned back by surface forces. The SOC float plane circling overhead confirms what the PT boat crews can hardly believe. Enemy ships about 7 miles northwest of Esperance headed away at high speed. The Japanese are running. PT-37 spots what appears to be a large ship run aground near Cape Esperance and launches 2 more torpedoes. The explosions that follow light up the night sky, probably one of the Japanese transports beached during an earlier failed supply run, but in the chaos and darkness, the PT boat crews claim another victory. By midnight, Iron Bottom Sound belongs to 8 American torpedo boats. The transformation is complete. Westholm, who began the evening as an untested squadron commander, has just orchestrated one of the most successful small boat actions in naval history. His crews, many of them teenagers 6 months removed from civilian life, have proven that courage and audacity can overcome overwhelming firepower. But perhaps the most profound change has occurred in the minds of Japanese naval commanders. For months, they had operated with virtual impunity in these waters. Their destroyer captains were the elite of the Imperial Navy, veterans of night actions across the Pacific. Tonight, they have been outfought by boys in wooden boats. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Every future Tokyo Express run will now carry the knowledge that American mosquito boats are prowling the darkness, willing to engage forces 10 times their size. The hunters have become the hunted. At 4:15 a.m., PT-109 responds to a distress call from PT-48, still hiding behind Savo Island with engine trouble. Westholm carefully approaches his disabled comrade and takes her under tow, a delicate operation in waters that could still hide Japanese submarines or patrol craft. As dawn breaks over Iron Bottom Sound, 8 American torpedo boats return to Tulagi Base. Not one man has been killed. Not one boat has been lost. but 11 Japanese destroyers have retreated without completing their supply mission. The mathematical impossibility has become reality. David has not only faced Goliath, he has sent him running. The morning sun reveals a transformed world. Lieutenant Rollin Westholm ties PT-109 to the tender dock at Tulagi at 5:20 a.m., his hands steady now despite the night's adrenaline. Around him, 7 other torpedo boats return from what will be remembered as one of the most audacious naval actions in American history. The crews climb onto the dock with the quiet confidence of men who have seen themselves under fire and discovered they will not break. But you have to understand, this wasn't just one successful night patrol. This was the moment everything changed in the Solomon Islands. For 4 months, the Tokyo Express had operated with near impunity. Japanese destroyer captains had developed an almost casual confidence in their night superiority, running supply missions like commuter trains. American forces could only watch helplessly as enemy reinforcements and supplies reached Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. December 7th, 1942 shattered that confidence forever. Within weeks, word spread through the Japanese fleet about the mosquito boats, small American torpedo craft willing to engage destroyers at point-blank range. What had begun as a tactical nuisance evolved into a strategic nightmare for Japanese commanders planning night operations. Motor Machinist's Mate Second Class, Cletus Osborne receives the Silver Star for his actions in PT-59's gun tub. But more importantly, his example becomes legend among PT boat crews across the Pacific. When ammunition catches fire around you, you don't abandon your post. You put out the fire and keep fighting. This mindset spreads like wildfire through American small craft units. From the Solomons to the Philippines, PT boat crews embrace a new doctrine. No target is too big, no odds too overwhelming, no mission too dangerous. The psychological warfare cuts both ways. While American morale soars, Japanese destroyer captains begin planning their routes with PT boat interference as a primary consideration. Night supply runs require additional escort vessels. Timetables must account for potential combat delays. The simple presence of these wooden boats in contested waters forces major tactical adjustments throughout the Japanese fleet. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding South Pacific operations, grasps the broader implications immediately. In his note to Admiral Chester Nimitz, he writes, "They are performing heroic services, and it is confidently expected that they will set a high record of valor and achievement in the service of their country." But Halsey understands something more profound. These PT boat actions represent a new form of naval warfare, asymmetric combat where small, agile forces can neutralize much larger opponents through superior tactics and unshakable determination. The strategic impact unfolds over months. Each successful PT boat action forces Japanese commanders to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive measures. Destroyers needed for fleet actions must be allocated to escort duties. Supply schedules become increasingly unreliable as PT boats make night waters too dangerous for routine operations. By February 1943, Japanese forces begin their withdrawal from Guadalcanal, a defeat that marks the beginning of their long retreat across the Pacific. While PT boat actions alone didn't win the campaign, they played a crucial role in the sustained pressure that made Japanese positions untenable. The human transformation is equally dramatic. Westholm, who began the war as an untested squadron commander, becomes one of the Pacific's most experienced small boat tacticians. His December 7th action report becomes required reading at PT boat training schools, its tactical lessons applied from the Aleutians to the Philippines. Ensign Bryant Larson, terrified on PT-109's bridge just months earlier, goes on to command his own boat, and train new crews in the aggressive tactics pioneered that night in Iron Bottom Sound. The psychological journey from civilian to warrior, compressed into a few hours of combat, becomes a template for thousands of young Americans thrust into similar situations. But perhaps the most significant legacy lies in proving that technological superiority means nothing without the will to use it effectively. Japanese destroyers carried more advanced radar, heavier guns, longer-range torpedoes, and better armor than American PT boats. On paper, the outcome of any engagement should have been predetermined. What the Japanese couldn't account for was the American willingness to press attacks regardless of odds, a cultural trait that would define Pacific warfare for the next 3 years. Today's Naval Special Operations Forces trace their lineage directly to these PT boat actions. The willingness of small units to engage vastly superior forces, the emphasis on speed and surprise over firepower, the acceptance of enormous risk for strategic gain. All these principles were forged in the tropical waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Modern asymmetric warfare, from missile boats in the Persian Gulf to special operations raids worldwide, follows tactical principles first proven effective by teenagers in wooden boats willing to charge Japanese destroyers in the darkness. The next time you hear about impossible odds being overcome through courage and determination, remember December 7th, 1942. Remember that sometimes the smallest force carries the biggest heart. Remember that terror doesn't always belong to the biggest gun. If this story of impossible courage inspired you, share it with someone who needs to remember that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. Because the real secret of PT boat success wasn't their boats. It was the Americans who sailed them into the night.